We have now had Sony's revamped PS Plus Extra and Premium service for 2 full years, and now it's time to check in on the service with a long-term review, talking about the amount of games that they're adding, how many games we're leaving, the day one launches, the quality of the games, of course the new value propositions, and also possibly losing some value because we'll answer all of this under the new context of PS Plus Extra and Premium is a lot more expensive now than when they launched it in mid-2022. So we'll answer that question. Is it still worth it? Because that is the one thing we have to acknowledge right out the gate, and that is the service saw a very steep price increase on September 6th, 2023. So before that date, PS Plus Extra was $100 USD per year. Now it's $135, a $35 increase, and then PS Plus Premium was $120, but now it's $160 USD, so a $40 price increase, a very steep bump in price. And so has Sony been able to keep up with that value proposition? Certainly with that price increase. So let's talk about that. Going into PS Plus Extra for the game catalog editions, in July we had some standout titles, that being It Takes Two, Sniper Elite 5, SnowRunner, Undertale is a very big game. That's one of our highest ranking games on here. You've also got some examples of Sony adding games like My Little Pony and Maritime Bay Adventure, which might be good if you have children, and that's the kind of game that is not going to have a Metacritic score, so that's not contributing to the average. But going into August, we did have some day one launches for PS Plus Extra, that being Sea of Stars, and also Moving Out 2, so 2 games, day one launches for that month. Going into September, we had Nier Replicant, Star Ocean: The Divine Force, 13 Sentinels, Unpacking is a really heartwarming game, but we also have, again, Paw Patrol the movie, so something that does not have a Metacritic score, but might be good for somebody with children. Going into October, we had Gotham Knights, which was not a well-received game, and that's actually okay because we do have to bear in mind, despite it being mixed, the real appeal to subscription is sometimes having access to games like Gotham Knights where you might not feel inclined to risk spending the full price on that game when it comes out if you're even a little bit curious, and who knows, you might end up liking it. So we do have to give some value to games like Gotham Knights when they are added to PS Plus Extra. But elsewhere throughout the month, it was also great to have more timely themed releases like Outlast 2 or House of Ashes for, this would have been Halloween at the time, but the real standout title for October is easily Disco Elysium: The Final Cut. Now, going into November, we had another day one launch title, that being Teardown for PS4, PS5. That is actually the PlayStation debut, so the game was already on Steam for about 3 years prior to that, but it is something where the first availability on PlayStation, nice to have it launch right into PS Plus Extra. For December, this was a very strong month, Grand Theft Auto 5 easily being the standout headline marquee title, although that is something where I would almost assume a lot of people have definitely played that game, or they own it, or they've experienced it in some way, shape, or form. So how much value that really adds, I'm not sure. Obviously, it is a very well-known, big, well-received game, although it is something where typically for a major AAA game, something from an established publisher like Rockstar, that's going to command a very high price tag from Sony's point of view to get it on the service. So these games typically only live on the service for a 6-month period, and the game's already expired because of that, although it is something where it was on offer at the time. Going into January, we had Tiny Tina's Wonderlands and Resident Evil 2 as the standout, well-reviewed games, and now we're getting into an area where it's the sort of back half of year 2 for PS Plus Extra, where you're going to notice a trend of not as many games being offered. So going into February, we had Need for Speed Unbound, The Outer Worlds Spacer's Choice Edition, Tales of Arise, Assassin's Creed Valhalla. These are all absolutely very good, enjoyable games. If anything, they're on the longer end, so you can get a lot of mileage and time out of these games, assuming you do like them, just not nearly as many titles for February, although we can say we had a day one debut, that being Foam Stars, so while the game might not have really resonated with a big audience, at least it was something where you could have been there at the time, day one, to try it out and see if it was or was not going to be a very big thing. Going into March, we had, again, kind of a light lineup. So NBA 2K24, Marvel Midnight Suns, RE3. You'll also notice LEGO DC Supervillains, which if you have not caught on just yet, LEGO does appear very frequently, so it seems like Sony and LEGO have a very good partnership, which maybe sheds more light on something like LEGO Horizon Adventures, but Going into April, we had a day one PlayStation console debut for Dave the Diver. Easily a fantastic game and really the standout title there. We also had another day one debut, that being Tales of Kenzera Zao, so that one on PlayStation 5, launching immediately as well. Also, Nor Play With Your Food, which was more of a high-profile game for Sony, where they seem to show that one off quite often. Going into May, we have another big Rockstar title, Red Dead Redemption 2 for PlayStation 4. So this one is still on the service right now. I'm a big advocate of the Cat Quest game, so it was great to see that. And Animal Well was also a day one debut into PS Plus Extra, and that game too ended up doing very well, where it seemed like it came not quite out of nowhere, but it really did surprise a lot of people, I think. So great to have that on day one for PS Plus Extra. And then going into June, present day, the most recent launch for the game lineup, we have Monster Hunter Rise, and well, that's really about it. This is one of the lower months in my opinion, even though the Metacritic score is about where some of the other months were landing, but you do have that. You've got Anno 1800 on there. Police Simulator is like a 58, so that might be one of those mixed, just try it to see if it works for you kind of games. Far Cry 4 obviously is fine if you're into Far Cry and you haven't tried that entry just yet, and you've also got 2 more LEGO games. So now that we've covered the full 12 months, we can start to identify a bit of a trend here, and it very much is true that Sony is slowing down on the sheer quantity of games that they're adding to the game catalog when we look at year one, where, well, in my year one review, I was covering 11 months at the time, but the full 12 months for the entire game catalog, Sony added 178 games to PS Plus Extra. But this year, it's 139 games. A noticeable drop mostly felt in the recent months, where that actually does line up quite nicely with something we did hear earlier in the year at the Game Developers Conference, where on the ground, that was the word across a lot of studios and a lot of indie devs, is that the big paychecks are drying up, so to speak. That being the checks that would be handed out from Sony and Microsoft for game subscription deals. At least at the time, a lot of people were saying that the paychecks either aren't nearly as big, or there's just not many being offered out there right now. And that also lines up with everything happening around us, that being, inflation, the mass layoffs across all these big companies, not just in gaming, mind you, but really everywhere. It's really been a brutal thing lately, and so to have all these services go up in price and also tightening up the budget to make them a little bit more juicy and increase those margins from the back end, we can see what's going on here. So as far as value proposition goes, it's not exactly looking good right now for PlayStation Plus Extra, but the one angle that I would also consider, and this is maybe a bit more qualitative, is that they are shying away from multiple entries and more familiar established names. What I mean is, you can look back at year one and you had multiple games for Assassin's Creed, Life is Strange, Yakuza, Kingdom Hearts, and those are the kind of games that, they're familiar. You know what you're getting into, and as a prospective subscriber, that might be something you want to see more of. But the other caveat to this, and something that Sony can't necessarily do all the time, is adding big major first-party games. Now, we know they don't add them day and date, but it's a matter of they're in the service now, so they can't add them again. So what we have to consider is that this is, in a way, a growing library of games here, right? So while titles do also rotate out, you'll see near the end that they do have a net gain here of the overall titles across Extra and Premium. So it's something where when they add Ratchet, it's there. When they add Horizon, it's there. They did that last year, so you're not going to see them do that again until they're ready to, throw in something like a Spider-Man 2 eventually, if that is something they will eventually do whenever that game slows down its sales pace. But I think what we can say for PS Plus Extra is that we saw a jump in price and then a decrease in the amount of titles, and arguably the kind of titles as well. So value-wise, we're a little bit upside down as we close out year two. But moving on to PlayStation Plus Premium, which does in a way have a lot of ground to cover, because having Premium by proxy means you have Extra, and you're paying more beyond Extra to get the Premium, and so now Premium has to make up that shortfall for the obvious loss of value that Extra experienced these past 12 months. And what we can say is that Premium did get some value add-on, How much more, I think, is negligible, but we'll start with what I think most people probably do want out of Premium, and that is the classic games. So we got 16 PS1 games and 15 PSP games, which is close to last year, but the big difference this time around, most recently, is we finally have that new PlayStation 2 emulator and brand new PS2 games with save states, rewinds, video presets, and custom button layouts now on the PlayStation Store. Which, that's the thing we can mention. You can buy them a la carte. You don't have to subscribe to Premium if you don't want to, like all the other classic games so far. They're not exactly tied to Premium, but the bonus here is that when you do subscribe to Premium, we have seen thus far, on a long-term basis, no classics have expired out of the program. So it does seem like, even though the library is building up very slowly, they do tend to stay on there for what seems like an indefinite amount of time, probably a very long-term license Sony has secured, but it certainly is much longer than what we see with Extra, where those games do tend to rotate on a 6-month to a year, 2-year basis, it seems. And the other big benefit is we're seeing implicit conversions, the company primarily responsible for bringing back all these games with their Syrup emulation engine. They're adding more trophies to the first-party games on a regular basis. It seems like those are always guaranteed nowadays, and now they're going back to third-party games as well and adding trophies to those, which, at least in my view, that is a pretty big value proposition for at least going back and replaying a lot of these games. And the floodgates are now finally open for PS2 games, even though we do have to set expectations on the kind of licenses they can realistically get, because it is still going to be an issue working with certain publishers to get their IP on the service where they don't want to agree to it, or IP that are completely lost to time and they're in purgatory, or a license that is tied up with a lot of music or celebrity likeness. So there's not many games we can realistically expect, not like 20 years ago, but at least we can finally see more games. And so this year we had 35 classic games compared to 39 last year. A similar number, but slightly down. The other thing we can look at is remasters. We got 14 remasters this time around. This part does rotate a little bit, but we've got some pretty well-known titles in here. Dragon's Crown Pro, JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, Klonoa, I think is awesome to finally have here. Legend of Mana, The Phoenix Wright, Ace Attorney Trilogy, some Star Ocean games. In a way, these are still very much classic games that add to the overall value for Premium, but the one very small inch of value that is worth noting is PSVR 2 games. We also recently got this in this tier as well, so now PlayStation Plus Premium, I would assume, is going to possibly see PSVR 2 games on a monthly basis. We initially got 5 from the Days of Play 2024 promotion, and then most recently from the June lineup, Kayak VR Mirage. So it is something where, while this might not be a big deal for most consumers because most people are not PSVR 2 owners, at the very minimum, if you do have it, that's great. And then if you don't have it, maybe it would be something where down the road as a prospective buyer, you would think, okay, maybe I would get a PSVR 2 knowing that with my premium subscription, I'm entitled to X, Y, and Z amount of VR2 games, and so I don't have to spend any money on those games initially. So that is worth considering now having PSVR 2 games in the catalog. Now, the other much more usable premium perk has been the full game trials, which Sony has not shied away from at all. They're still doing a lot of them, especially for pretty big marquee titles that are great to jump into for at least an hour, 2 hours. Sometimes we can get trials for upwards of 4 or 5 hours. It really depends on what appears to be more of a publisher decision, because some games are pretty long, but they don't really get that much time. But ideally, titles that are like really big and have a large opening, you can get a few hours out of that game before you decide if you want to buy it or not. So while I have not used trials myself all that much, there is a lot of utility to this, and there's about 124 trials right now on PlayStation Network. So they are certainly adding a lot more, and it's something where if you know you can get mileage out of this, then it's still there and they're still adding more of it. But moving on to a new perk for PS Plus Premium, and that is PlayStation 5 Cloud Game Streaming. Sony has finally deployed actual PS5 server blades across various data centers globally, and so now, if you're so inclined, you can actually stream PS5 games, both from the game catalog and titles you own outright digitally as well, which we don't know exactly how many titles that is, but at least from the game catalog sorted by PS5 only, there's 223 titles available to stream. And it's actually quite quite usable. Dare I say, good. It's something where you can experience between 50-60 milliseconds of latency, so if you do have a high tolerance, then you'll probably be able to play it just fine without really feeling much of anything, because the core issue with Sony streaming has always been, well, the server blades they built for PS3, which are really bad and not very good at all. PlayStation 4, better, but still very questionable and not a great experience. This, however, up to 4K 60 frames per second, not full high frame rate modes, but you can do 4K 60. You can get full 5.1 and 7.1 audio. You can get 3D audio. It really is something where there's not many compromises. It's sort of an instant thing where you launch the application. You do have to sit there for a little bit just to be tied to a server and then start, playing the game from there. But it is something where it'll be a lot faster than, say, installing a 70 to 90 gigabyte game, and that's the upside to PS5 game streaming. It's still not my first decision to play games, and therefore I don't really ever use it, but it is quite handy to jump right into a game if you want to do that without having to download or install the entire thing. More so, the utility is for the game trials, where since you're only going to be playing that game for about, let's say, 2-3 hours, then jump into it that way, and the game's still going to make a very good impression because you're not really compromising on the sheer quality and look and feel of that game when the streaming is that good, assuming your home network is up to snuff, because you will need a decent speed for at least streaming in 4K at 60 frames per second. So with that in mind, in terms of how much value that really adds, it's still, in the grand scheme of things, I would argue pretty low, but it is substantially better than the PS3 and PS4 streaming. So it is there, it's worth trying and seeing for yourself just how usable it is, and if maybe you can get some mileage out of it. Now, the other somewhat recent new PS Plus Premium perk is the Sony Pictures Core application, which is Sony's separate a la carte streaming service where you can buy or rent TV shows or movies, and premium members have access to 100 free movies on that service. So it's a separate tailored catalog, random movies in there like The Mask of Zorro, House of Flying Daggers. There's a lot of Resident Evil movies on there, and I've seen people describe this before as the kind of movies you would get for free on an airline, which is not really the most flattering thing to hear, but let's be honest, that's kind of what these movies are, in a way. I mean, they're not awful per se, but it's one of those things where if you didn't know about this, it's not like you're hearing this information now and realizing, oh, okay, now this sells it for me, I can buy premium for a year. It's maybe something where you have premium and you go, okay, now that I've learned this info, let me check out the selection, and maybe there's 1 or 2 movies and it's like, okay, I'll watch those, right? Otherwise, this is not really the value add that I think premium really needed. I guess it's welcomed. That, and also they threw in some Crunchyroll in there as well. Not a whole lot. There's only like 6 TV shows on there with a few seasons each, so they're not complete. But it is something where you can watch a little bit of anime or 100 kind of mishmash movies that in some ways have airline energy. So now that we've gone over nearly everything, let's talk about the final count for the entire library across Extra and Premium, and also compare that to where we were 2 years ago and 1 year ago. So on day one, right when PS Plus properly relaunched, the service had about 779 games total, which at the time the count was a bit inaccurate, just given that certain tiles on the screen were repeating for PS4 and PS5 versions of the same game, but it was around 779. So with that same counting methodology going into a year later, it was 929 games, and going into today, it is 971 games total. So there is a net gain on the amount of titles that they're adding and also taking out, but there is a very important distinction to make here, which is the tiers themselves, because as we've already said, Premium does not really have titles expiring all that often at all. Some of the remasters do go, but the classics are staying. Extra, though, much more aggressive with how many times games are expiring on a monthly basis. It can oftentimes be between, 5 to 10, 15 titles. Sometimes we can have a mass exodus of upwards of 35 titles, as we saw very recently. So Sony has been maintaining the Extra library, which is good, but The core issue long term could be if Sony does continue, say, degrading the quality of games, or in a sense the familiarity of certain big IP. Maybe they start to focus on smaller deals and maybe lesser known titles. If they lean further into the more mixed category of games, then you're going to see all the good stuff eventually leave the service and not return. There is a certain turnover rate that we have to consider with Extra over a long period of time. Right now it's not a concerning thing, but we did see in the past 4 or 5 months that it was something the company really started to double down on, and we did hear about this back during GDC. So with where PlayStation Plus Extra and Premium sits right now, it's a much tougher buy, if only because it's one of those weird angles of how, despite any price tag they put on this, right? I mean, it would have to be very high for it to factually not make sense for the amount of games that you're getting. Like, no matter how you spin it, you are getting 970 games at your disposal to play for upwards of $160 a year. Factually, that's a good deal, but games are consumed in a much different manner. So at a certain point, it just doesn't really matter how many games you're offering, because you can't reasonably play or even engage with all those games. It becomes a matter of, what's even there worth my own play habits? Does it make sense for me? It kind of gets into a cable pricing situation in a way, because if it's too high, you just don't care about all this extra stuff that you're not even bothering to play, right? So I think PS Plus Extra and Premium are kind of in a very awkward spot, because the price increase was very steep. I mean, there was no hoping that it was going to stay the same price forever, but to see it go up that much after the relaunch, which wasn't even that long ago, it was, I think for a lot of people, a tough pill to swallow. But there certainly is still value even at that $160 price tag per year. But I think it's priced out a lot of people where it just doesn't make sense, especially in relation to their own play habits. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this useful, and I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.